I'm John Little of OmegaShock.com, and this is the Weekend ShockCast for Saturday, May 10th, 2014. I understand the difficulty people have in believing that we are so close to the end. I really do. The world that we live in seems so normal and appropriate that we can't imagine even the possibility of a collapse. I've lived most of my adult life outside of the United States, and that fact gives me some extra clarity in how exceptional American life is, but even I struggle with the mathematical inevitability of the collapse of America. Unfortunately, the U.S. is going to collapse, and there is nothing that we can do about it, and all that we can do is get out of the way and keep ourselves untarnished by the corruption that made that collapse inevitable. You need to think carefully and ask God about where He wants you to be and what He wants you to be doing. Devastation is coming, and it is richly deserved. God called us to holiness and a pure life, and we rebelled against that call. We have forgotten that God always visits judgment upon all who rebel against Him, and we have rebelled in every way imaginable. If my calculations are correct, that judgment is coming sometime between now and 2018. So what did we talk about this week? This week we talked about relocation, the collapse of the U.S. dollar, the irony surrounding the Chinese, and the rise of Satanism, along with our willing participation. If God is calling you to escape the coming apocalypse, it is possible, and there are places that you can go, but only if you are willing to pay that price. The IMF appears to be preparing for the collapse of the U.S. dollar. The Chinese appear to be preparing to grab as much of America as they can, and the abominations coming out of America are amazing and right out in the open. So let's talk about that. On Monday, it was Relocation, interview with James Wesley Rawls. We are now witnessing the countdown to apocalypse, and yes, I mean that, both in terms of how we use the word apocalypse today and how that word was originally meant. In a terrifyingly short period of time, we will see the worst disaster to hit the world since the Great Flood, and it will be a revelation. The challenge lies in avoiding the former so that you can experience the latter. The only way that you will avoid this cataclysm is by relocation. If an atomic bomb is going to explode, wisdom would suggest that you get as far from ground zero as possible. And the U.S. and Europe have ground zero painted all over them. Sometime during the next 4 years, America and Europe are going to be destroyed. Pause for a moment and let that sink in. At some moment in time, between now and the end of 2018, you will die a terrible death, or you will be enslaved. And I told you why last week. Now, I'm no prophet, so the time frame might be a bit longer or shorter. There's also the possibility that the U.S. might escape the worst of Ezekiel 39:6 or Isaiah 30:26. All of that is possible. But are you going to pin your hopes on such a slim chance? You know that we are living in the last days, and the time period that we are living in right now started 47 years ago. You can try to convince yourself that there's a lot of time left before disaster strikes, but God didn't consult with you when He laid out the events of these last days. To paraphrase Ayn Rand, you can avoid truth, but you cannot avoid the consequences of avoiding truth. God has given all of us plenty of warning. The question is whether you will heed that warning and get out of the way of incoming disaster, or whether you will convince yourself that tomorrow will be like today. Will you listen to the warning and take action? You must get as far from ground zero as possible, and that means relocating, moving to a safer place. The question is where? As I said before, East Asia, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand are the best areas to go. But those aren't the only places to survive. You can survive in the U.S. if you are far from a city and do not need electricity or fuel. If you do not need electricity or fuel for your water needs, then you might be okay. And there are places in the U.S. that are ready for such situations. There are also places outside of the U.S. that are ready for this, and I was reminded of that fact by an interview between Barry J. of drescapes.com and James Wesley Rawls of survivalblog.com. I've never heard anyone ever get JWR to open up about relocation outside of the U.S. like Barry did, and Barry had some intriguing things to say himself. The interview is broken up into 3 videos. Part 1, we are headed for a collapse. Part 2, the government clamped down on expatriation. And Part 3, James Wesley Rawls debunks the third world country myth. You can find those 3 videos in the article I wrote on Monday. I haven't thought much about the Dominican Republic. It shares an island with Haiti, and, well, an island would be a pretty good place to be in a collapse situation, assuming that the neighboring country on the island doesn't try to start a war with you. I have friends from Haiti, so I'll have to ask if that's possible. Whatever happens, you must prepare for life without electricity. The people of the Dominican Republic seem to be able to do so. If you live further south, will you escape the effects of the massive solar flare that's coming? I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. I strongly recommend that you take steps to either be able to live without electricity or to be able to obtain it on your own. Unfortunately, there's no do-over button should any of us calculate wrong. Those of you who would like more resources on preparation and relocation, I highly recommend James Wesley Rawls' website, survivalblog.com. JWR is a sincere man of God and one that I respect very, very highly. Pay close attention to everything that he says, and then make your own choices. The person hosting the interview with James Wesley Rawls is Barry J., and his website is www.drescapes.com. What he has to say is intriguing, so you might think about the Dominican Republic. If nothing else, there are resources on his site that could be of help to you. I now leave you with 4 choices. You can follow my recommendation by going to the other side of the planet and living in East Asia. You can follow James Wesley Rawls to the American Redoubt. You can follow the suggestion of Barry J. by choosing to live in a third world country. Or you can choose to suffer a terrible death. There is no 5th choice. Are you ready for this? On Tuesday was Relocation. The price is high. I have been talking about relocation for a while, and the reasons for doing so are growing in number and size. It's easy for me to talk about this because I made the decision and paid the price for that decision a long time ago, and the pain of that price has faded. But that's not your situation. For you, this price is yet to be paid. You look around at the life you have, and the thought of giving it all up is more than you can bear. I wish with all my heart that I could spare you that, but I can't. I spend a lot of time talking about the big picture. I talk loudly and incessantly about the implication of certain events and what you must do to survive them. Very rarely do I talk about the personal price that you will pay in heeding my warnings. That personal price was brought home to me last night as I was answering an email. The writer had gotten the message and understood the price, and the heartache was huge. And I so much wanted to say that it wasn't going to be as bad as they thought, but that would have been a lie. I've lived in Asia for more than 18 years. 15 of those years were spent in the western side in the Middle East, Israel. And I'm creeping up on 4 years on the eastern side, here in Taiwan. Where I'll be next is, well, hard to say, but I believe that God will send us back to Israel. I've had a love for Israel since my early teens, so it was an easy decision to go to Israel. It was 1992. I was 26. I'd had 8 years of college and was ready to take on the world. But instead of changing the world, I wound up the one being changed. You can probably tell that I'm a pretty hard-headed guy, so it takes some really rough handling to get my attention and convince me to change. And I still bear the scars of those battles with God. I thank God that I lost every one of those battles, and I guess that I should be thankful for all that I've lost in the struggle. But I need to be honest with you. Deep down, I resent having had to go through all that, and there's a part of me that complains about how badly I've been mistreated. And at those moments in time when I complain the loudest, God always reminds me of the decision that I made. I was 12 years old on a school bus going home. I was staring out the window, and I asked God to use me in whichever way He wanted. And God has been faithful to that request. And all that I have to do to have Him ease up on the price is take back that desire to serve. That's all it takes. Just give up. The problem is that there are people out there who are on their way to eternal punishment. People are in harm's way, and I know the way out. I can't stand down while lives are on the line. I just can't. And the price that the Lord paid for me, His suffering and death for my sins, how could I be so wicked as to not go out and seek to rescue the lost? Furthermore, Christians suffered for 2,000 years to bring salvation to my door, and it is the least that I can do to pass that message of redemption on to others. Does that make me a wonderful person? It does not. In fact, I am fortunate that God hasn't struck me down for being what He hates the most, arrogant and proud. A proud heart is an abomination to God, Proverbs 16:5, and I have truly been an abomination far, far too many times. I'm actually quite serious when I joke that my wife is perfect, but a bad judge of character. I can personally attest that the price for relocation could be everything that you hold dear. Everything. Your health, your wealth, your family, your career, your sense of identity, and even the idea that you are right with God. You could lose all of that and more. I've seen families crushed and marriages torn apart. But I've also seen that God never puts you through more than you can bear, and it's always, always for your own good. Always. My more than 18 years in Asia has been almost more than I could take, and the price was terrible. But I would do it again. I would still grumble and moan about how awful it all was, but I really would do it again. I am inviting you to do the same. Are you ready to love God more than any other thing or person on this earth? Are you ready to put your future in His hands and trust Him that the price will never be too high? And be careful, that resolve will be tested. Most of us understand this passage from Luke 14. And whosoever doth not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, sitteth not down first and counteth the cost, whether he have sufficient to finish it? Luke 14, verses 27 and 28. We like to put a positive spin on that passage when we apply it to ourselves, but maybe you should pay more attention to the one that is just a few verses down. Quote, So likewise, whosoever he be of you that forsaketh not all that he hath, he cannot be my disciple. Luke 14:33. Jesus demands everything. Are you ready to pay? Are you ready for this? On Wednesday, it was, is IMF preparing for dollar collapse? It should be clear to everyone by now that the U.S. dollar is staring into the abyss. It's going to crash, and there is nothing that you and I can do about it. The only thing that we can do is get out of the way. You don't want to get run over by this collapse. Of course, those that we have entrusted with the job of reporting this collapse to us are lying. That's why we look for signs that indicate that the lying liars are getting ready for the collapse. One of those lying liars is the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. If I was the IMF and handing out loans to distressed countries right now, I would do everything that I could to make sure that I got my money back. That means making loans in a currency that will be worth something in the future. Is that why the IMF loan to Ukraine was denominated in SDRs? Greg Hunter talked about this with Doug Casey this week, and it was picked up by BitcoinAssay.com the Bitcoin assay article was picked up by Blacklisted News, and now I have it. Isn't the internet wonderful? The great thing about SDRs, also known as XDR, is that you can change the underlying assets that give it value. It's a moving goalpost. The special drawing right is whatever the IMF wants it to be, and you can bet that the borrower is never going to come out ahead in any deal with the IMF. What is the SDR? An SDR is essentially a unit of value backed by a basket of currencies. It's US dollars, or about 41.9%, euros at 37.4%, Japanese yen at 9.4%, and British pounds at 11.3%. If any one of those currencies crashes, the IMF can switch that currency out for another one. So yes, you can claim that there is a strong US dollar component to the loan made to Ukraine, but that component can change at any time. And please remember that before this, the International Monetary Fund was making loans almost exclusively in US dollars. Is this the first step by the IMF in an attempt to limit the possible damage from a US dollar collapse? Greg Hunter raised that question in his interview with Doug Casey. That interview is called Doug Casey, No Way Out, Stock, Bond, and Real Estate Markets Will Collapse. We can debate over the question about whether or not this is a plan by the IMF to prepare for a crash of the US dollar. What is not debatable is the fact that this is yet another crack in the petrodollar system. Should the IMF start announcing more SDR loans, sit up and take notice. Some very smart people have been talking about 2014 as the year when everything changes. The problem is that the vast majority of those changes will happen in smoke-filled back rooms away from the public eye. You won't see them until it's too late to do anything about it. If you haven't started buying as much silver as you can carry and as much gold as you can afford, now is the time. Those of you without the extra cash for that should start stocking up on extra essentials with a long shelf life. Better yet, get out of the U.S. entirely. I talk about all of this here in my shock plan for getting ready, putting it all together. All of my articles end with a link to that preparation plan. Do more than just think about it. Are you ready for this? On Thursday, it was Chinese irony. Living in Taipei, you'd think that I would talk about China more than I do, and it's true that I certainly have more experience with the Chinese than most. I've taught Chinese students, and my wife is Chinese by culture and Taiwanese by birth. I also like the Chinese. They're full of interesting contradictions and foibles. They're not as polished or as sophisticated as those of us from the West, and they're far more honest and sincere than we are. And Chinese Christians? We can't hold a candle to them. They are superior to us in every way, and we should be ashamed of that. Someone told me once that should the Lord delay his return, it will be Chinese missionaries that bring Christianity to the world. And I'm afraid that my experience validates this. I say afraid because it's shameful that we Americans have fallen so far. Just 60 years ago, the average unsaved man was more honest and moral than the average Christian in America today. I can hardly believe how awful we are. Did you know that pornography is against the law in China? Did you know that the sex scenes in American movies are taken out before they can be shown in China? In a recent Christian Mingle survey, 90% of Christian singles indicated that they would be comfortable with premarital sex. And America produces 89% of the world's pornography. Amazing. All of this was brought to mind when I saw Dave Hodges' recent series on China's intentions to attack and occupy America. You can find parts 1, 2, and 3 in the links that I provide in the article. He's not done with this series, and his interview on the subject with Dr. Jim Garrow is also set to appear on his site in the very near future. So keep checking back with thecommonsenseshow.com on a regular basis. I did my own series on Chinese intentions just a month ago, and there are 4 articles with Chinese plans to exterminate the U.S. It makes me sick to think about all this, but the evil that we have created, supported, and tolerated tells me that we deserve it. No, actually, it's worse than that. Our corruption is so bad that we must be stopped, so that the Christians in other parts of the world will not be corrupted by us. We are destroying the morality and spirituality of the world, so we must be stopped. And when I say we, I mean American Christians first and foremost. Our lives blaspheme the name of God, and we are a disgrace. And I so desperately wish that it wasn't so. I really, really do. So as we contemplate our own justifiable demise, let me ask you a question. Do you think that it's a coincidence that the one place in the world that will be spared the brunt of Ezekiel's fire, Ezekiel 39:6, is in East Asia? There are 100 million Chinese Christians that deserve to live in a world unpolluted by the filth coming from America. So no, I do not consider it to be a coincidence that the fire I wrote about last week will fall most heavily on Russia, Europe, and the U.S. I don't think it's a coincidence at all. What an irony that God seeks to spare the Chinese the worst of his wrath, because there are 100 million Chinese Christians who have not blackened the name of Christ. God certainly has not appointed them to wrath. Quote, "For the time is come that judgment must begin at the house of God, and if it first begin at us, what shall the end be of them that obey not the gospel of God?" 1 Peter 4:17. Judgment is coming for America, and it is so richly deserved. Are you ready for this? On Friday, it was Satanism Goes Mainstream. I was going to go in a different direction today, but when I sat down to write, I made the mistake of looking at the Drudge Report. God really does have a way of derailing the best-laid plans of mice and men. Satanism has really hit the mainstream in a big way. You and I have known about Satanism for a long time. We know that Lucifer is alive and well on planet Earth, and that his minions have been building the foundation for the coming of Antichrist for centuries. But we have never seen Satanism go quite this mainstream. And yes, atheism is just another flavor of Satanism. Satan isn't actually a name. It's a description. It's Hebrew, Satan, and it's pronounced Satan, not Satan. And it means adversary. Of course, the description became a title, so here we are. Are atheists really Satanists in disguise? Yeah, they really are. Please understand that atheists aren't atheists because they don't believe that God exists. That's impossible to prove. So what they're really saying is that they are upset at the idea of God and want to get rid of every mention of his name. So yeah, they're Satanists. But that's not why I'm here taking up your time with yet another article. I'm here to point something out to you. Does the rise of outright Satanism in the mainstream tell you something? When Paul was speaking about the Antichrist, he said this, quote, "And now ye know what withholdeth, that he might be revealed in his time. For the mystery of iniquity doth already work, only he who now letteth will let, until he be taken out of the way." 2 Thessalonians 2:6 and 7. There is something restraining Satan from bringing his Antichrist, and for 2,000 years Satanism has been an underground religion. But something has changed. Satanism is no longer underground, it's in the mainstream, and we are starting to see its effect. Here is this article from the Telegraph titled, "Decline of Religious Belief Means We Need More Exorcists, Says Catholics." I find it fascinating that a mainstream newspaper like the Telegraph is publishing an article that talks about the dramatic increase in demon possession. That's amazing. But let's not forget the most popular form of Satanism out there, atheism. And it's getting its own TV channel. From an article titled, "Atheists to Launch the First TV Channel Dedicated to Godlessness." a whole TV channel will be devoted to the belief in nothing. Do you see a problem here? Harvard has also reared its ugly head over the issue in an article titled Catholic Church Condemns Black Mass Reenactment at Harvard University. There is nothing like a good satanic ritual to fill that spiritual void you've been carrying around with you. And as I did a quick search for more mainstream Satanism, I ran across this article titled American Horror Story Coven. Satanic Witchcraft Goes Mainstream. I've been gone from the U.S. since 2010, and even then I was only there for less than 4 years and never picked up the TV habit. So maybe I'm a bit more shocked than you are, but look at just a few of the plot elements in this show. Quote, a teenage witch using her powers to cause a bus accident that leaves the young men on the bus dismembered and dead, with their dismembered bodies and severed heads shown up close. Another quote, a flashback scene focuses on Madame Lalaurie, who is one of the many historical references in the show, a wealthy slave owner keeping slaves chained in the attic of her mansion where they are tortured. They have the skin peeled from their faces and organs dug out of their bodies with a metal hook. The madam then uses their blood as makeup on her face to maintain her youthful look for an enchantment spell to keep her husband faithful. Here's another one. 2 of the witches enact a spell that requires a pledge to Satan in order to resurrect a young man who had inadvertently died in the bus crash. They take his severed limbs and parts from other victims of the crash to reassemble his body, all shown on screen. Another one. A mother sexually abuses her injured son in extremely graphic fashion while he is lying in bed. Another plot element is a young witch in the coven has sexual relations with an undead human-animal hybrid. And then there's Zoe, the star of the show, who has the ability to kill any man she has had intimate relations with as they suffer violent brain aneurysm and their eyes explode in a bloody mess, shown on screen. She uses this ability, again shown in graphic fashion, to murder a young man while he is in a coma in the hospital. And this abomination is in its 3rd season. Do you think that any of this would have been possible if our churches hadn't become filthy and degenerate? As the Telegraph article illustrates, the fall of the church has brought the rise of Satanism. Our corruption has brought this about. We did this. And when we should be on our hands and knees repenting of our sins and begging God for His forgiveness, we have doubled down. I briefly mentioned pornography yesterday. You might want to take a closer look at the statistics. I provided a link to a page that is a compilation of them. That page updates as new statistics become available. Did you know that half of all pastors regularly view pornography? Our churches have lost their anointing. Our salt has lost its savor. We are no longer the preservation of the nation. We have exited the field of battle, and Satan has a free hand. That which stood against the coming of the Antichrist stands no more. God help us all. Are you ready for this? This has been the Weekend ShockCast for Saturday, May 10th, 2014. I'm John Little of OmegaShock.com. Have a great weekend.